The question I got when we were starting was, why do I as a Christian need to understand creation science? And the answer is so you can answer the questions of the world when science is used as a weapon against Christianity. So when you examine the worldview, there's really two worldviews. The one on the right is the secular worldview, where we've been told for 100 years that the Earth is a million. Well, it's actually supposed to be 4.6 billion years old, and all of the animals and vegetation are millions of years old, and that the universe is about 13.6 billion years old. So all these vast times are used, and but on the other hand, in the Bible, it's fairly clear if you go through the genealogies, and the genealogies are in the New Testament too. You know, with a lot of people look at all the begots that are in the books of Genesis and say so-and-so begot so-and-so who begot so-and-so. But in the narrative of discussing Jesus Christ in the New Testament, the genealogies are repeated, and it goes back to Adam. So the genealogy is taken back to Adam. And so if we're people sometimes like to ascribe the Old Testament as being allegory and biblical stories to tell basic truths about life and humanity. It's actually also in the New Testament, so I don't think that's taken as allegory. We don't think Jesus Christ was allegory. So my statement is, a lot of people will say the Bible is not a science textbook, and I agree with them. It's not a science textbook. So you can't invent a new medicine. You can't describe how a transistor works or how to broadcast information between antennas from the Bible, but you can count on the book. It has both spiritual truths and it has scientific truths in the Bible. So it has a description of how the universe began with space-time, matter, and energy. It has a description of the sources of the earth and the heavens. It has a description of the origin of the earth's atmosphere and hydrosphere, the water that's on the planet. And we'll talk about that tonight. That's very important. Talks about the cause of life and the origin of man and marriage and evil and suffering and governments and how language started and all that. So it has a lot of information in it that if you read it carefully, and it's spread all through the Bible. A lot of it is in the first 11 chapters of Genesis, but it's all, as a lot of these truths are, it's in many, many books of the Bible. I personally believe that science, for many reasons, has been the term science, when you see it used. Science says this and science says that. I think it's a term that's really been hijacked by Satan to act against Christianity. And a lot of times you'll say, oh, well, science has proven that there is no God, or science has proven that the universe can create itself from nothing. But those aren't proofs. They actually logically can't be proofs. You can't prove a negative with science. So you can say the data, the preponderance of the data is congruent with some thesis, but you can't prove something like that. And I like this quote: the greatest enemy of knowledge is not ignorance, it's the illusion of knowledge. And I think what the people have nowadays is the illusion of having knowledge. You can go to Caltech or UCLA or Berkeley or MIT campuses, and you can find a lot of people who think very highly of themselves, but is that really true knowledge, or is it just pride? So tonight we're going to talk about geology. So the thing that struck me is I actually was teaching this at my middle school, and the kids were really concerned with geology, and especially the flood. And so geology is just the study of the earth, structure, substance, and its history, and the processes that go on. And it's contrived or composed of two words, geo, which means earth, and ology, which means the study of, so the study of the earth. And what we see today, there's very distinct secular theories that give a description of how things are formed in order that we end up seeing what we see. But if you have a knowledge of the biblical description in the books of Genesis and other places in the Bible, you'll see that it tells a very much different story. And I think one that is more congruent with the facts that you see when you're looking at the result, like Grand Canyon and many other facets, the sedimentary layers and the fossil record, etc. So what we have to understand is that the worldwide flood is a cataclysmic example of something that happened to the earth that secular scientists don't believe in. They absolutely don't believe in a worldwide flood. They propose that there was a worldwide flood on Mars, where there's just trace amounts of water frozen at the north and south pole of Mars, and our planet is 71% covered with water, but they don't believe that there was a universal flood here, but they think that happened in Mars. And so they say, and even a lot of the Christian ministries say, those that don't believe in the young earth, they say that the flood actually happened in what they call the Fertile Crescent. This, if you go back through your college or high school books on history of the world, they'll say, well, there were settlements, which are true. There was an area that was very agriculturally productive, so Fertile Crescent, shaped like a crescent moon. And they say that at some point in time that was flooded. It's bordered on the one side by the Mediterranean and the other side of the Gulf, the Persian Gulf. So somehow there was a flood in there, and that's what was written in the Bible, and so that the worldwide flood never happened. It's ironic to think if someone wanted to escape the flood, they would just have to go up into the mountains. In that case, if the water was flowing between those two bodies, if you wanted to survive. And it says in the Bible that God intended to kill all of the air-breathing animals, like birds, that had the life of breath in their nostrils. He would have just sent them up into the mountains. You didn't have to build a giant ark, etc. So that's the thesis that secular scientists, and as I say, there's a lot of scientists, or a lot of Christians that talk about the compatibility of science with faith, but they'll say, oh, it was just a local flood so that they can continue to have evolution. With the flood, if the flood happened, evolution couldn't happen, because if all of the life forms on Earth were terminated except for a few people on the ark, they claim we wouldn't see what we do, but we do. So that's important to know. So let me review the chronology. Just shut that off. So yeah. So let me go through the chronology, and this is all based on the Bible. So the initiation of the flood, if you ask most Christians that don't study this in any depth, you say, well, describe the flood. Well, okay, so God got mad at the immorality and sin that was on the world, and so he caused the rains to come for 40 days and 40 nights, and the water rose, and then it flooded the earth, and then there were some fountains of the deep. They're not really sure what that means, but there were fountains of the deep that broke open, and the whole world was covered with water above the highest mountains, and that lasted for some period of time. They probably don't know the exact time, and then the waters went away, and the ark landed on the top of a mountain, and all the people and animals got off, and that's what the flood was to them. But it has a lot more structure to it than that. Yes, the early earth had a what they call in the Bible a vapor canopy above in the sky, and it also had subterranean water trapped between layers in the earth, and that the rain came down when the fountains, the subterranean water burst up through the ground because of the gravity that's pulling the top layer of earth towards the center, as you see on the bottom. So you have this water here that was trapped. The gravitational attraction of this 100-kilometer thick earth layer is pushing down. The water was shooting up like a giant super soaker. Shooting, it actually would have launched the water, if you do the calculation, into outer space. So the water rise, and as time went on, it actually took 150 days of time that they said in the Bible the water rose, got higher and higher for 150 days. And so what that means is not all of those subterranean chambers collapsed simultaneously. It means one collapsed and then another collapsed, and then all around the world, and each one, as it collapsed, the water level got higher and higher and higher with each collapse. And finally, all of the chambers that were going to collapse had collapsed at 150 days, but there was still water in some of the ones that didn't collapse. And so then you have a time period where the water is subsiding. God caused the mountains to rise and the valleys to fall. So if you have a flat surface that's covered with water and you push up an area, then that part of the land sticks above the water. And if you cause a valley to form, then the water runs off into that valley. And that's how we got the dry land and the deep oceans that we have. And then finally, after over 360 days, the land was dry enough and safe enough for people to go out and animals to go out. And Noah, thank God, had a sacrifice, built a little stone memorial and had a sacrifice to thank God for saving them. And God gave him the rainbow to show that he would never flood the earth again, gave them a sign. And so all of these references here, there's a Genesis reference, and there's references in Psalms, talk about the subterranean water. They call it fountains of the deep, and they also talk about the pillars of the earth. So the pillars of the earth, people mock that. In the medieval times, when the people didn't know very much, they would come up with silly drawings like this, where the earth was floating in some giant bathtub of water, or sometimes they would claim that the earth was on the back of a turtle and it was flying through space, or whatever those guys were drinking. But that isn't, we know that isn't physically true. This and the firmament that they're talking about, we to this day don't really know what that layer of water that was suspended above the earth. It could have been ice crystals. It could have been water vapor. We don't know. But it fell when the flood started. God made that material fall, and that contributed to the rain. So if you look at what the cross-section of the earth would look like before the flood, so here are the pillars, so here's the land above, this is the trapped water, there's more trapped water over here, this is a pillar that the earth stuck stuck down and contacted the inner part of the earth with the outer. So it's like a table. I was telling the kids at school, it's like a table, and the legs of the table, or the pillars that stick down, it supports the surface. So you can have water under the table, walk on top of the table, you never know the water's there until the legs collapse. Then you're doused into the water. It's like a dunk chamber. So we have to understand that the world before the flood was significantly different. One of the differences was, and these are the biblical references, the animals and humans were all plant eaters. They're all vegetarians. There was no rain. There was this canopy that shielded the earth from, it was like a cloud or something that prevented ultraviolet radiation. And so that's one of the reasons why people live so long. You read in the Bible that Methuselah lived 969 years. That's one of the things that would have helped him live longer. It also, some of the information, looking at the gases trapped in amber bubbles, you can see that the oxygen was higher and also the carbon dioxide was higher. So the whole earth was like a greenhouse. It was warm because they find, why do we find gasoline deposits in the North Sea? Why do we find them in Alaska, way up north? Because that part of the world was covered with lush green vegetation, just like the rest of the world. So the whole world was like, maybe the rainforest in Brazil. Just a lot of immense amounts of vegetation, and then low hills and the subterranean water. So that's before the flood. During the flood, then we have this subterranean water bursting out, the water jetting up supersonically. All of the life on Earth, since it's over a year of flood, you can't, there's no food. Even if you find a raft or something to float on, at some point you die because there's no food. And then the earth is covered with water everywhere. And then at the end, the submerged surfaces of the earth have great forces applied to them, and the mountain areas are thrust up, and the valleys of where the oceans were depressed, and so the water runs off, and so now we have dry land and oceans. After the flood, immediately after the flood, because all of the thermal occurrences that happened during the flood, you have extremely warm oceans. And the warm oceans, the evaporation rate of water goes up by the fourth power of the temperature. So the higher the temperature of an ocean, the more the evaporation is at a significantly rapidly increasing rate. So it's not just like linear, if a degree and it goes up a certain amount, and 2 degrees it goes up another amount. No, 1 degree it goes up double, and then it goes up like 8 times, and then it goes up like 128 times. It's going up as the fourth power of the temperature. So the evaporation rate is tremendous. And where does all that water go? It goes up into the sky, forms clouds, that blocks the sun, that cools the earth. So now the higher atmosphere is very cold. There's a lot of moisture up there. It snows, and it snows, and it snows. And if the summers are not warm enough to melt the snow, then the snow accumulates more and more and more, and that's the ice age. So we had one ice age right after the flood. It lasted for about 200 to 400 years. During that time, the water levels throughout the world were 400 feet lower. So you could walk to Catalina. You could walk from London to Paris, walk. You could walk to Australia from Thailand. So if you lower the water, and you can see it today, you lower the water levels. When they're talking about animals and people migrating, there weren't any oceans to cross. if you wanted to go to Australia, you just walk there. It's a long walk from Mount Ararat, where the ark was, but you can walk there. And I'll show you some slides. And then this is, if you had depressions, if you had bowls after the flood, those would fill with water. As the water ran off, if there was no path, no river that could empty that water, it'd be like Salton Sea. The water comes in, has nowhere to go, and it just sits there. And what happens is, if that sits there and you have a giant amount of water and then there's a breach somewhere, then that water rushes with tremendous force out of that breach and forms canyons like the Grand Canyon. That's how the Grand Canyon was formed, is this giant amount of water. They said the water would have covered parts of Utah, Arizona, New Mexico. It was at that area around the Four Corners. That's where the initiation of the Grand Canyon started. And it's very clear. You know, it's not a little tiny river running for millions of years, because it has a lot of features that don't conform to that theory. So there's 6 steps. So I'll go through these 6 steps in detail so that you understand what happened. So step 1 is the pre-flood. So the pre-flood, here we have the vapor canopy. So this is a greenhouse effect. So everything on Earth is moist and green and warm. Everything from the North Pole to the South Pole had vegetation growing on it. The seas were shallower and the mountains were pretty low. And God came to Noah when he was 600 years old and told him that he should start building an ark. And it had never rained before. The moisture, the vegetation was watered by seepage of water from the ground. And here's the subterranean fountains of the deep. And here are the pillars. They're very crude because I did them myself on PowerPoint, but these are the pillars. So these pillars are holding up this whole 100 kilometers of rock, and these oceans are sitting down here waiting for God to open them up. So the features are vapor canopy, subterranean water, low hills, not high mountains. Okay, number 2. So this is the initiation of the flood. So the initiation of the flood, God causes the pillars to start cracking. The sagging of the great weight of this earth moving down caused a great pressure. So this giant super soaker that's shooting water into outer space. The canopy, vapor canopy, is destroyed in a certain way. So the rain comes down for 40 days, but these subterranean chambers continue to break up over the 150 days, so the water keeps rising. So the features there, the subterranean fountains of the deep break open, vapor canopy falls, and extreme rain conditions. The worst rain you've ever seen times 100. Third, this is during the flood. So during the flood, the earth is moving around. God is causing the layers to shift, because this earth was sitting on essentially a water layer. It had the ability to shift horizontally, and it would also shift if it moved up. It would force mountains up. So volcanoes were erupting because of the hot magma coming from the interior. There were probably tornadoes in that happening, electrical storms, just chaos. You can't imagine the chaotic conditions. So violent weather, volcanoes, and the earth is shifting. It's shifting up, it's shifting laterally all over the world. So just to pause for a second, if there were no mountains on the earth, and you made the earth to be like a cue ball in a pool table, there's enough water on Earth right now to cover the whole surface of the Earth to a depth of 1.7 miles. So there's enough water. If the Earth's surface was flat enough, everything would be covered to almost 2 miles deep. And this is some of the depths. So it's I just looked this up off the internet, but it's entirely possible. Okay, fourth stage, post-flood. This is right after the flood ceased. Noah's off the ark. The ark is now landed up here at the top of Mount Ararat or someplace and some high mountain. The post-flood mountains are high. The sedimentary layers that are formed by the runoff of the sorting of the water have formed. They're still icky and gooey, like the surface of the Japan area by the Fukushima power plant, devastation. So the waters of the seas that are resulting are warm. So as I said, the evaporation rate is to the 4th power of temperature. And so the water is evaporating like crazy. The evaporation of the water causes the clouds to form, heavy clouds all over the world. You've heard the term nuclear winter. So they say if there's a nuclear exchange between superpowers, we're going to have darkness reign because all of the dust and everything that's blown up into the upper atmosphere causes the clouds to form, and so the temperature of the earth would fall many, many degrees. So that's what's happening. So the oceans are warm, but the air above the oceans are cooling off because the sunlight is being blocked from getting through. So the features are the ark on the top of the mountains. The high mountains have risen, the ocean basins have sunken, the volcanoes are still erupting, the high ocean evaporation rate because of its high temperature, because of all the volcanic activity, and the clouds block the sun. So the air is cool, the water is warm. Stage 5, so this is the post-ice age. So now the ice ages have been going on for 200 to 400 years. As the clouds in the atmosphere dissipate over time. That's a long time. The clouds are dissipating now. The sunlight is starting to come in. It's starting to melt the ocean or melt the ice from the ice age. And so that water is running down into the ocean and it's refilling it from the 400 feet depression back up to where we see it today. So the features are heavy snow and cloud cover. Ocean level is lower, but it's rising slowly, and the weather is extremely cold. So that's right after the flood. And then the last one is where we are today. So now we have clouds, but they don't cover the whole earth. They cover maybe a 25-30%, depending on what the weather pattern is. There's still mountains that have snow on top that have never melted. Mount Ararat is a very high mountain, so it's covered by snow all year long. The water now has risen to its depth that we see today. So we have most of the snow has melted. The oceans have risen and they've cooled off over time, and the weather warms up, and there's infrequent volcanoes, but there's still volcanoes. We still see them, Mount St. Helens erupting, and there was one erupting, I think, in Mexico somewhere. So those are the stages. If you understand that, that is what allows you to understand what we see today by the geology that we can get our hands on. So the common questions are, where did the water come from in the flood? So we know that the answer is it's from the water canopy in the subterranean chambers. That's very clear. Where did the water go? It's stored in the ocean, so all you have to do is drive out to the coastline and look west, and you see where the water went. And could the water keep rising for 150 days after the rain stopped? It could, if these subterranean water chambers are bursting sequentially. They didn't burst at all at the same time. So those are the answers. There's no mystery there. None of those questions are a mystery. We know the answer. Okay, so this is so I now have the secular viewpoint. So what the secular scientists tell us is that way in the past, you can look this up on the internet, there was a supercontinent. All the land masses were touching each other. It's called Pangea. And so here it is. There's the continents, and then as the plate tectonics, we have the plates that are moving around very slowly, a few centimeters per year, and that moves the land masses apart. And so we go from this one cluster, you see that cluster of land, and now over millions, billions of years, at 4 centimeters per year, it's pulling everything apart, and you're getting all the different continents. Notice in that picture, at no time, as you see that simulation, is the whole world covered with water. It's not blue. There's always land that's sticking up out of the water. And so that'll be important in a minute. And then we have the crust. We know that we have tectonic plate movement. We have what we call the ring of fire, where the edge of the plates are. So we have volcanoes and other things at that point. Okay, so what does biblical creation science tells us? It says in the Bible there was a landmass, so the idea of a single landmass before the flood is probably true. But the flood, in our mind, covered the whole world. So the water did cover everything. There was no landmass that stuck out of the water. It was all covered. And then what we see today is what the geologists suggest. We find the continents are drifting very slowly, and the ring of fire, we have the volcanoes and the earthquakes on that area where the plate tectonics are rubbing together. In geology, there's a term called uniformitarianism. That's a good Scrabble word, worth lots of points. And what it says, there's a guy named James Hutton. He was a Scotsman. He was trained as a lawyer, but he loved geology. So what he did was he wrote a book in the early 1800s, and he came up with this idea, and his phrase that people picked up on from the book is underneath that piece of mountain there, says the present is the key to the past. So what you see going on today is what went on in the past. And he doesn't believe that meant that he did not believe in the global flood, because we don't see global floods today. And so he said, and the dead organisms, which we call fossils, which became fossils, those are animals that were walking along and fell over, died, and then they slowly get eaten away and then covered with dust that comes down, or maybe a stray avalanche of material might have covered them over. But everything is very slow. It takes billions of years for all this to happen. For the creationists, we believe something catastrophic can explain what we see. You see the picture here. I use the same picture. So we're seeing the people who believe in secular science and the people who believe in creation. We have the same rocks. Today, we analyze, you can look at a rock, or I can look at a rock, and a guy who's a secular scientist can look at a rock, and we talk about it, and we have our opinions, but the opinions are based on what our worldview is. So do we believe the Bible, or do we believe secular explanations? And so here, everything changed. As we saw in those 6 slides, everything changed throughout the whole world with that catastrophic flood of Noah. So that's the main thing that you have to. That's the differences. And then the dead organisms that are filling the what they call the geologic column. Those are animals that were basically killed in the flood. They drowned in the flood. and then they were encased in rock, and I'll show you how that is done in just a second. So if you think back and you took your any class that had geology in it, and you're talking about rocks, we have three kinds of rocks. One sedimentary, metamorphic, and igneous. Sedimentary rocks, sediment. That sediment is usually always associated with water. You know, you say, you look at a lake or you have a glass of something, what's that sediment in the bottom of my glass? It's filled with liquid. And so over time, the people, although they still, the secular scientists call it sedimentary rock, they don't want to talk about a flood. You know, no, this is sedimentary rock, but it's accumulated over vast periods of time. And when you look, this is a picture of Grand Canyon. Somebody up here sitting watching the canyon, the water flowing. But you look at these mountain sides, and you see layer after layer after layer, a layer of sediment. Sedimentary rock typically exists as distinct layer of strata, right? It's like a very, very thick multi-layer wedding cake or birthday cake, whatever you want to think about it. It's layer after layer after layer. And the layers, they're straight, not bumpy. And so we actually did over at our school, we actually took dirt, went out and dug in certain areas and got some different kinds of dirt and mushed them all together and put them in a flask, and then we poured water in over the flask and we shook it up and it becomes just brown, and you have to wait for a day. But when you can do that experiment with a Coke bottle at home, fill it up partly with dirt, put your hand over, shake it up and leave it somewhere, and then look at it a few days later, and you see these striations, they form. And the reason they form, it's called hydrological sorting. And the sorting occurs because of gravity. So you've got the particles are suspended when when you shake it up, and then you set it down, and so gravity is pulling. So the gravity is pulling on the big rocks and it's pulling on the little rocks, and that sorts the layers of rocks into those strata over time. So the large particles, medium particles, and here's, this is Bryce Canyon, Utah. I come from Utah, so I've got a couple of Utah shots. That's Arches National Park in Utah. Again, look at those striations. These are all sedimentary rock. This one has had erosion by wind or water in the past, and it's got this beautiful arch. They also see them in Hawaii, one of my favorite places, Waimea Canyon. You look at the mountainsides, striations. You look at Australia, here's in the outback, you look at a mountainside and here are the layers of sediment, striations. Here's China, striations again and again, and here's Jordan on the way into Petra. If you've ever gone to Petra in Jordan, you see in the rocks, these are weathered and have been opened up so that the people can get through these mountainsides, but you see the striations. So it's everywhere. It's not a one-off example of something that's weird. So if we look at how on the left this is how you would see it, just like we did in the flask when we did the experiment, and the layers form and the layers are all flat. If you had a layer forming and then you say, okay, well, millions of years passed and then another layer forms. Well, in the millions of years that go by before the next layers start forming, you're going to have wind erosion, you're going to have water erosion, so you're going to have a bumpy surface. So then you cover that bumpy surface over with some more, then you have more erosion, and then you cover that over. So what you should see, if it's done by just in the air where the dust is falling on the ground, it will conform to all this bumpiness. But when you look at these surfaces, they're all absolutely planar, stacked one on top of each other. You don't see striations in there. So to me, that says immediately this is done by water, and this hypothetically could be done by air, but that's not what we're seeing over here. This is reality. This is what they say. So even what they're saying. And what could cover the world with sediment? Maybe a global flood. And what we see, so I'm going to now jump over to the evidences. What are the evidence we would see today if there was a worldwide flood? So I want to go through the evidences. One, we would see a rip in the surface of the earth where the waters shot up from those subterranean water chambers. And they're there. Unfortunately, they're under the ocean. You know, they're buried under the ocean, but we can see them with the sonar. We can investigate the surfaces of the bottoms of the ocean, and they're called the ridges. There's mountains. Those are mountains. They're not just little bumps. Those are tall mountains underwater that are the remnant of the fountains that broke open. You also see folded mountains, and the people who talk about this kind of observation, they're telling you, well, these rock formations are formed by the uplifting and the squeezing of rock layers together, and they show, okay, well, it starts here and then it gets bigger and bigger. I don't know about you, but I tried to lay tile when I was a young teenager and 20-year-old. And I found out that it doesn't fold. That was one thing, it doesn't fold like a smooth. And I'll show you, here's a mountain that formed. So that rock, look at this rock here. And they say that that rock was solid and it folded up in that rounded kind of configuration. I don't think so. You know, that rock would shatter. And here's another one. Over here, you see how rounded that is? That looks like the rock was wet and it was compressed, so it buckled in the center. You can see where it's buckling here, and it goes up and conforms this rounded kind of shape. I think that's an absolute, giveaway that was formed when the rock was not rock solid, not hardened. It was still pasty, it was still, you could still fold it and bend it without it cracking. Here's another one, bent rock formations. You see these things coming up, going down. You see them, this one re-entrant, it goes over here and then goes back on itself. All of these things. This would shatter if it was a rock. If you had a bunch of rocks and you compressed them, they would shatter. And here's the one that's shown a lot. Look at these mountains. Go up and down, up and down, up and down. This is in Europe. Bent rock formations observed all over the world. And I think I've got these two little guys here that are pushing. Those, to my mind, have to be made when the rock is malleable enough that it's pasty, and then it gets pushed in that form, and then over time the water evaporates and the rock is hard. If you look at the sediment, this is the result of Mount St. Helens erupting. When Mount St. Helens erupted, let me go to the Mount St. Helens. So this is the eruption that occurred. So Mount St. Helens looked like this, and then the eruption at the top, and then it blew out the northeast face of the mountain with the volcanic activity, and all of the snow and dirt and everything and water poured down the side of that mountain instantly. Just gravity pulled it down, just tons and tons of mud and everything. And what you see is the rapid formation. It doesn't take millions of years to form a canyon that has almost vertical sidewalls. This is a human. Here's this for scale. This is a human standing here, and these are the dates. They actually tracked it as it grew. Grew over time. So if you look at the Grand Canyon looks a lot like that, only 40 times bigger. If you had the 40 times bigger event than Mount St. Helens erupting, that's what we would expect to see. It's not caused by this little river that's running through here. It's caused by that rapid water flowing And here's a bigger picture of that one I showed you before. Here's the lakes. They have Grand Lake, and the other one is Hopi Lake, Hopi Indian Lake. And down here is where the breach occurred, and then once that breach occurred, all of this bottom half of Utah, the western lower half of Colorado, New Mexico, partially covered by water, and a lot of Arizona, all of that dumped through that breach, and it formed the Grand Canyon in probably a month. And one of the features of the Grand Canyon that you see is you see the river. This is the river running down the side of the Grand Canyon. You see this slope sidewalls, but you see these side canyons. You see that canyon that goes up there and then stops? And you see this canyon here that comes down here and stops? There's no river going up that canyon. That was formed by water spilling over the edge of the plateau here and carving that out. So water was spilling not just through the breach, but the land had water that came over this edge and carved out this side canyon, and it carved out this side canyon. So when you draw that's the river, and then here are the side canyons, those arrows. There's no water running up there, so you can't have erosion from a river. So you have to have it spilling over the top. That's the only way you can get water to erode these side canyons, what they call side canyons. Okay, and what would you expect to find with regard to evidence with the coal? These are the coal deposits, the major coal deposits in the United States. Here's where the coal is. And when you look at these coal seams, all of the coal seams are flat and parallel. So the black stuff is coal, and then there's some intervening sedimentary rock, and then there's some more coal. So it says that there was a bunch of vegetation that was crushed down, maybe by the early stages of the flood, and then there was another portion of time when another portion of the fountains of the deep broke, and there was another layer of sediment laid down, and then there was more vegetation. Maybe that vegetation was floating on the surface, and then it over time became waterlogged and fell down. So you see these coal seams, they're all parallel, they're all flat. And you see them all over all over the world. Germany, everywhere there's coal, there's that looks exactly the same way. And then with regard to some of these, what they call polystrate fossils, these are tree fossils that are sticking up through layers and layers of mud. And people who are clinging to the uniformitarian idea, they say, oh, well, the tree was standing there for millions of years. You have a tree that's standing, a dead tree that's standing for millions of years, and it got slowly covered over with layers and layers of dirt. What happens is when you have a flood, the trees float vertically or horizontally on the water at the beginning, and then because the base of the tree is fatter than the top, it gets waterlogged, and so it pulls that base of the tree under, and then as it gets more waterlogged, the tree goes to the bottom of the lake, and then it embeds itself, and over time, as the sediment comes, the waterborne sediment covers the tree, just like the dirt experiment we had. Then that's how you explain these trees that are standing straight up. So that's covered, here you see the layers of sedimentation, and over here you see a tree that, this is the side of a hillocks collapse, but you clearly see the tree sticking through those layers of sedimentation. And then with regard to fossils, if I was trying to explain worldwide flood, what I would expect is I would expect billions of dead things buried all over the earth in graveyards, and that's exactly what you see. You'll see fossil graveyards of dinosaurs, you see fossil graveyards of fish. These are crustaceans, these are trilobites, so these were Cambrian era horseshoe crab that were buried. And so over and over and over, all over the world, you see these graveyards. Why would animals, if they died, gather together to pass away. It's not like the elephant's burial ground. And also, here's a fossil. Here's the top of Mount Everest. 29,028 is the peak of Mount Everest. At 28,871 feet, you find marine fossils. How did they get up there? Here's a very delicate. This is called a Herein, and this is one of those animals that look like a plant, but it has these little tentacles and it has a base, and they're very delicate. That was fossilized, and that's found up there. So the tops of the highest mountains are covered with marine fossils. And I showed you that picture when I was showing you the Pangea where the continents were expanding. Those, and I said, watch carefully those segments of the Earth never go underwater. So it can't be that this was underwater from Pangea, because they claim that Pangea was formed just by the lateral translation on the tops of these plates. So Everest would have never been underwater, but there's marine fossils all over up there. Here's some pictures, evidence that you would see, paleontology, whale fossils. Oh, they find whale fossils. Where did they find them? Oh, they found them in the Sahara Desert. And then they found them. There's actually a desert in Chile. This is right by a highway. They were building this highway and they came across the whale fossil. This is the driest desert, even drier than Death Valley and even drier than the Sahara Desert. And there's whale fossils. And these are pretty high up. So how did that get there? This is what we see, and it doesn't get reported anywhere. So the other thing is that has been found is that there are lakes and underground water all over the world. So if you go home and you're curious enough, you can go and Google the term subterranean ocean. When you do that, you see listing of annotation after annotation after annotation after annotation after annotation all over the world. So what I did is I went through here, and it's hard to see, but these are the lists of where people have found. They claim that the water that is currently under the earth is 3 times more than we have on the surface. 3 times more water is trapped inside the earth than is on the surface. And this is published in Science, this is published in Nature. These are Discovery Magazine, all kinds of reputable, this is something since the early 2000s that people, and I've drawn a map here with these red arrows, they're pointing to the United States. There's water under the United States, there's water under China, there's water under Antarctica, there's water under Brazil. So it's not just one localized spot, it's all over the world. And so that, I believe, is the remnants of the fountains of the deep, the subterranean water that has been left there that didn't all come up when the flood occurred. So if you want to go to references on culture, a lot of the history is written as oral traditions, and some of it's written down as written history. When you go and look at these isolated people, they all have a history of a person that was saved by going onto a boat. The whole world was flooded. They took animals onto the boat to be saved. It isn't exactly 100% what the Bible narrative is, but it's very, very close. And if you were a people, say the Hawaiians or Polynesian people that migrated after the Tower of Babel dispersion, and you had this story, this would be a cataclysmic story. Everybody around the world would know it. And so the flood story is from Polynesia, there's flood stories from Babylon, there's flood stories from Mexico, all over. So this is a little chart that says the human record of traditions, and here are the countries. You've got Assyria, Persia, Syria, Asia Minor, Greece, Egypt, Italy, Lithuania, Russia, China, India, in the western Mexico, US, Peru. It's all over the world. So all over the world, and down here are the elements. Man transgressed. These are the ones, the little green boxes say this is where transgression happened. Divine intervention. A favored family. So there was one favored family. There was ark, a boat provided. Destruction by water. So all of them had the destruction by water. Humans survived. Animals saved. Universal destruction. Landing on top of a mountain. Most, a good portion of them have them landing on the mountain. So it's like the game of telephone where you're whispering a secret around a bunch of people and it comes back to you and it sounds somewhat the same, but it isn't exactly the same. So that's the thing. They knew the history at one point, and it's told over and over and over and over. And they don't have a Bible that's written meticulously and maintained the purity and the accuracy. So it drifts over time. But that's, to me, very amazing that all these cultures have similar stories. Even in the tribes north of Australia, they have traditions, and when the missionaries went to visit them, the Christian missionaries, the natives were saying, "Oh yeah, we know all about that." They said, "Oh well, we're going to teach you about a flood that covered the whole earth." Yeah, we know about that, and so they were agreeing with them. Amazing. And this is the level. So here is the water. This is the thousands of years ago. Okay. And this is where the water level is. So the water level is where it is today. This is today's, and these are in meters. So 20 meters, which is more than, so that would be a little over 60 feet, 120 feet, so forth down. And this is where would have been flooded. Jamaica would have been flooded. Australia would have been flooded. Tahiti would have been flooded. And what's the evidence? So we're saying, this is when the flood, or this is what the water level was after the Great Ice Age. And then it slowly, as the ice melted, it came back up, and now we're very stable of the sea level now today. So what's the proof? Archaeology finds underwater cities. This is pictures off Alexandria, Egypt. These are heads of statues. They found buildings, they found artworks, they found tools, they found chariots, etc., 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 all out in the Mediterranean Ocean, buried hundreds of feet underwater, so scuba divers can go down. Next one, India. This is off the southern coast of India. They found cities. Here's buildings with sidewalls. Here's pavement. Here's another, so this is like a chariot way or some kind of a road that went through these buildings that are on the bottom of the ocean south of India. Japan. Here's a building that they found off of Okinawa. And you see the skin divers here, and you see these steps. These are not natural formations. These are buildings that they're finding down under the ocean. And off Cuba, between Cuba and Miami, they find these temples that are discovered. These are French skin divers that have found these, and these buildings are halfway between Cuba and Miami. And if you look, so you got to get oriented to really understand. So the black regions are what the land masses are today. So here's the United States, here's South America, Australia, India, and India's here, Africa. The red, let me go back. The red areas are where the sea level would have been during the maximum of the ice age. So as I say, if you wanted to go from, well, you don't really see, I've got Europe coming up. But if you wanted to walk from India to Australia, you just walk. You didn't need a boat. If you wanted to walk across the Bering Strait between Russia and Alaska, go to it. Just walk across there. You walk to Greenland, Iceland. You know, you can walk from here if you had this blown up. You can walk from Miami Beach to Cuba. It's astounding. And that's how the animals migrated when they got off the ark. They say, well, how did the kangaroos get to Australia? There's a big ocean. They don't swim very well. What are you going to do? Oh, they walked. The water level was way lower. So it makes, once you understand what happened during the flood and subsequent right after the flood, that answers those questions. Here's Europe. Here's the United Kingdom. So the United Kingdom is in kind of this peach color or flesh color. Here's France. This green area, the blue is water. This is at the height of the flood or the post ice age where the water level was so low. And this was an area called Doggerland. Doggerland. And what they did was the Norwegians were scraping the ocean with giant nets to catch fish, doing massive fishing in that area. And when they pulled the nets up, they found in the bottom right-hand corner, they found all of these spearheads. And then they found farm tools. And then they found cow bones at the bottom of the ocean. So there was a thriving, and this is well established. You can look online, look up Dogger, not Dodger, D-O-G-G-E-R land. And they have a whole section of the British Museum that's dedicated to this land that was there and now is under hundreds of feet of water in the channel between Denmark and Scotland. I'll skip over that. And then you find it written in rock. A lot of the Sumerian culture, they had the cuneiform writing at the early stages. And so when you go and look in these museums, again, it isn't publicized, but there are tablets that report the life of Sumerian kings to be 900 years old. There's tablets that talk about the worldwide flood. These are in Turkey. This is found in, I think it's Iran. There's actually a tomb. People scoff at Jonah, who was eaten by the large fish. Actually, his tomb was in northern Iraq, and it was destroyed by ISIS. They obliterated the tomb as part of their cultural exchange. Moses, 10 plagues, that they found writings in Egypt that have all of the 10 plagues of Moses written down as happening to their people. Babylon, people have asserted that Babylon never existed. They found it. They're people doing archaeology. You never hear about it, but it's on the map. You can look on the map and find Babylon. Jericho, they didn't think that was a real place until they discovered it, and it was so curious because all the walls of the city, it was a walled city, all the walls had been pushed outwards, like a giant hand had pushed down, and the walls all flattened, so that Joshua could walk in. And then Sodom and Gomorrah, they found those. So archaeology finds all this stuff, but they never talk about it. You never hear about it on Nat. Do you ever hear it on Nat Geo or Discovery Channel? Never. So anyway, to wrap up, the Bible is, our touchstone. We believe in it. We believe in its accuracy and everything. Genesis and geology. And I always liked the quotation, because we're talking about geology from Luke, when Jesus are being admonished that his apostles are talking about his greatness as he comes into Jerusalem. He says, talking to the Pharisees and the Sadducees, he says, I tell you, if these kept quiet, the stones would cry out. And I think what we saw tonight, to me, the stones are crying out the truth. And nobody is hearing it because it's not being told. And we're being told a story that is absolutely incorrect when you are able to see the stages of the flood and what happened, and that is why we see what we see today. So that's all I have.